Hi, I'm Rebecca Brown, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my Poplet that I did, my flowchart that I did on behavioral learning theory. In behavioral learning theory, there's two theories within it. There's association theory and reinforcement theory. With the association theory, classical conditioning falls underneath association theory, and operant conditioning falls underneath reinforcement theory. Classical conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was the main psychologist that practiced classical conditioning. He did an experiment back in 1927 that was on dogs salivating. Basically, when a dog heard a bell ring, it was when they smelt the meat, and when they were smelling the meat and they heard a bell ring, they associated the two. The dogs associated the two stimuluses together and salivated. Eventually, they took the meat away, and the dog still salivated when they heard the bell ring. You have one of our words this week was automatic or reflexive responses. An automatic and reflective response is when your body subconsciously reacts to a stimulus. And it goes hand in hand with below the level of consciousness, which is basically your subconscious mind triggers events to happen when you don't even think about it. So when you get air blown in your face, you might automatically blink your eyes. And that's a subconscious thought, or it's below the conscious thought. It's automatic and it's reflexive. Or like if you're in the doctor's office and you get your knee, they hit your reflexes in your knee, and that's an automatic subconscious thought. You have no control over it. In the classical conditioning, we learned about the unconditional stimulus, the conditional stimulus, the unconditional response, and the conditioned response. And along with the unconditional stimulus and the unconditional response is the neutral stimulus. Basically, the neutral stimulus and the unconditional stimulus go hand in hand. They're almost the same exact thing. A natural stimulus is anything, like I said here, anything of the five senses. So if you smell something, the smelling of something, that's a natural stimulus. If you smell food, that's going to cause a response. But an unconditional stimulus is just that. It's the same, that it's not planned out. So if you walk into a restaurant and you smell foods, it might have turned you off. It might, you might like it. And then you have the unconditional response. It's a natural response to an unconditional or neutral stimulus. Over here we have the conditioned response, an unnatural source used to create a setup response. It's almost like you plan, you try out, you purposely do something to try to get a purposeful response. So a conditioned stimulus is a conditioned response. This is the result of a natural, unconditioned, or conditioned stimulus. Over here to the right, we have the reinforcement theory, and within the reinforcement theory is the operant conditioning. Two psychologists that studied the reinforcement theory is Edward Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is one of the most famous psychologists from our history. He believed that if you did something positive, you got positive consequences. If you did something negative, you got negative consequences. With Edward Thorndike, he believed the same thing, which is the reinforcement theory. He tried an experiment called puzzle boxes, and he took cats and he trapped them inside the boxes, and the only way that they could get out is if they manipulated something that he set up inside the box in order to be able to open up the door. And eventually the cats figured out that if they pressed a certain button or pulled on a certain string, the door would eventually open. And then Skinner, he did boxes as well. They were called Skinner boxes. He put birds in the boxes, and if they did something 10 times in a row, then they were rewarded in some sort of way. But it was a set amount of times that they had to perform certain type of a certain procedure. They had to click on a button for about 10 times, and then in the end they would get a good deed. They would get a reward in response to that. Over here to the left, there's negative punishment, negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, and positive punishment. All of these they all kind of connect in some way. When you have a negative punishment, which is giving bad consequences, it's something that you don't really want to do. Especially if you think of a child, you wouldn't want to do bad consequences and negative punishment. But you also have positive reinforcement, telling someone good job or offering a reward. Positive reinforcement is shown to actually be very effective. Appetitive is where our bodies want to make our bodies happy. So and then negative reinforcement is not giving a reward even when someone did well, which is not very effective when trying to teach someone and reinforce them that they're doing something good to try to get them to learn to do behavioral learning. Negative reinforcement would not be an effective way to get someone to learn something. However, it could help with trying to change someone's behavior. Negative reinforcement would help someone if they came in and they had a bad characteristic trait and they wanted to change that. And like a therapist could do negative reinforcements to try to help change a behavior. Positive punishment. I gave the example, my way of defining positive punishment would be you get pulled over by a cop, and that's punishment within itself because it's embarrassing. But they only give you a warning. So it's kind of positive because you didn't get the negative effects, the negative consequences to getting pulled over. You didn't get a ticket and had to pay like $300-400. Adversize is like where you pretty much almost hate to do something, to not want to do something or not like something. And when you put positive punishment and negative reinforcement together, you get a result of adversize. And if you take negative punishment and positive reinforcement and put them together, you get appetive. The last thing I'm going to talk about is fixed ratio schedule. It's when you're given a specific amount of times a person or animal has to do something before given an award. So kind of like what Skinner does, he with his boxes, he gives a specific amount of times that the birds have to do something before they get rewarded. Fixed ratio schedule. Along with that is the variable ratio schedule. When there's not a set number of times a person or animal has to do something before they get rewarded. It's just that the person experimenting can vary up the amounts. One time it might be 10 times, the next time it might be 15, and it's not that effective. Fixed ratio is just more effective. Fixed interval schedule is a fixed amount of days in between with no stimulus. So there might be 2 days that you have your birds. You might have your birds, you might train with them 2 days and then 2 days you don't. That's a fixed interval schedule. Variable interval schedule is a varied amount of days in between the stimulus, in which out of all of them is probably the least effective because it's so variable, it's so inconsistent that the person that's trying to change a behavior or learn a behavior, when you're not as consistent, it's not as effective. So there's a varied amount of days in between the schedule. And that's what I have for behavioral learning theory.